This is Six Music.
BBC Radio 6 Music documentaries, telling the stories in music that matter.
It's what we do.
It's the beauty of Six Music.
Find out more at the 6 Music website. Now, 6 Music documentaries present Bowie's Heroes with Matt Everett.
I'm Matt Everett, and this is part 2 of Bowie's Heroes, where we look at the artists that inspired David Bowie throughout his career. We've already looked at his early heroes like Mark Bolan, Lou Reed, George Orwell and Syd Barrett, but in the mid-70s Bowie's artistic focus shifted from America to Europe, and this time it was a place that inspired him. In '76 he moved to Berlin to start a remarkable run of albums, Low, Heroes and Lodger, known as the Berlin Trilogy, even though they were recorded in Berlin, northern France and Switzerland, and New York. As a city, Berlin was hugely influential, and the bleak, somehow romantic atmosphere can be felt in Bowie's music of the time. Producer, Tony Visconti.
We recorded the band in Hansa Studios by just 500 yards from East Berlin, from the wall. And every afternoon I'd sit down in that desk and see 3 Russian Red Guards looking at us with binoculars, with their Sten guns over their shoulders and the barbed wire, and I knew that there were mines buried in that wall, and that atmosphere was so provocative and so stimulating and so frightening that the band played with so much energy. I think they wanted to go home, actually.
That's Kraftwerk with Tanz Musik, and Kraftwerk were one of the German bands, along with Neu, that Bowie looked to inspire him at this time. They had, in Bowie's words, a singular determination to stand apart from stereotypical American chord sequences. He made no secret of this. This track, V2 Schneider, from Bowie's Heroes, was a tribute to Kraftwerk member Florian Schneider. Brian Eno also enters the picture here. Eno made his name making strange electronic keyboard noises for Roxy Music, but also created his own experimental albums and brought his abstract techniques into the sessions for the Berlin Trilogy.
I had been developing more and more the sort of ambient idea and the idea of sonic painting, you might say, and was very up for doing more of that. David, meanwhile, had been working with this amazing group of players, the people who'd been on Young Americans and on Station to Station. A great, great funk band, basically. I think we quite separately start to imagine this fusion of sort of European electronica with funk, with a sort of mood overlay, if you like. And we were both, I know that we were both thinking very cinematically about this. We were both thinking that each of these pieces that we would do should be like a small film of some kind.
Berlin also served as a place to quit drugs, a goal that Bowie shared with his companion, Iggy Pop.
I just did too much, and I came close several times to overdosing, and it was like being in a car where the steering had gone out of control and you were going towards the edge of a cliff, and whatever you did with the wheel, it was inevitable that you were going to go over the edge. And I just felt like that. I just felt I'd almost resigned myself to the fact that I'm going over the edge. I'm not going to be able to stop, and it's it. And I started really getting very, very worried for my life, and I just had to get myself out of that situation. So I ended up in Berlin, the smack capital of Europe. Again, I really didn't have any idea until I got there that that's in fact what it was. And who did I take with me? Iggy Pop, who was trying to get off smack. But we actually did very well. We were very successful.
Bowie and Iggy had met in 1971, but while in Berlin, he produced two of Iggy's greatest solo albums, The Idiot and Lust for Life. Here's Iggy from '77.
I met David Bowie in a bar in New York, and what with one thing and another, I decided it was time to do another album. I don't want to give away our secrets. He played a very strong role in the music. I can't give him enough credit. He hit my feelings. Just that album sounds the way I feel.
Night clubbing, we're night clubbing, we're what's happening. Night clubbing, we're night clubbing, we're an ice machine. We see people, brand new people, there's something to see. Night clubbing, we're night clubbing, oh, isn't it wine?
Bowie also helped promote his friend's career.
The clutch of his fans knew his songs really well, but outside of that, it was very hard for people to understand what the big fuss was about, because they'd never bothered to find out what kind of writer, what a great, wonderful, funny, pithy, great writer he is. And it just seemed obvious to me that I had a slightly bigger audience than him, that I would take some of those songs and try and introduce them to people,
Musically, Bowie and Iggy overlapped a lot during this period. They wrote the song China Girl for Iggy in 1977. Which Bowie would re-record in 1983 in a slightly different style.
I could escape this feeling with my China girl. I feel a wreck without my little China girl. I hear her heart beating.
A real hero of Bowie's is American composer Philip Glass, a leading figure in contemporary classical music since the mid-60s. You can hear Glass's textual style in a lot of Bowie's work, like in this track, War's a War, from Low. Repaying the artistic debt, in the 80s, Glass composed two symphonies based around the themes from Low and Heroes.
Of course, in the mid-70s, we all knew David. We all knew who he was.
And the projects that he and Brian did together, the Low, Heroes, and Lodger, were very interesting projects for everyone. It was clear that David was involved with the same artistic community in a general way that I had been. The fact that he is associated with the world of commercial music and I'm associated with the world of concert music is fairly minor. The reason that we were all so interested in David's work was because we could see in the methodology of the work a similar kind of process. The Low record was done, you can hear it's done by overdubbing, by layering musical ideas and creating textures. And it's a way where the process of making the work becomes the overall guide of the work. This is very much an idea that artists were working in the 70s, whether it was process art or if it was minimal art or whatever it was, where the actual process of making the work became almost an achievable end in itself, and that the work actually becomes a kind of byproduct. You can hear that in Subterraneans, for example, which is the work that I used for the first movement of the symphony that I did.
So if you need some context, while Bowie was holed up in Berlin obsessing over minimalist classical composers around 1977, the rest of the world was into punk and the bands that followed. So Bowie sidestepped punk altogether and as a result wasn't dated by it. As an advert for Heroes proclaimed at the time, there's old wave, there's new wave, and there's David Bowie. In the 80s, something odd happens, and the people who grew up worshipping Bowie were making music themselves. The new romantic movement looked to his music and fashion style, and now Ultravox, Duran Duran, and this band, Spandau Ballet, were becoming stars. So what does Bowie do next? Well, he's well known for making difficult, abrasive art rock, so he releases a massive mainstream pop hit. Ashes to Ashes. Producer Tony Visconti.
Obviously, Ashes to Ashes took everyone by surprise, and everyone sort of expected one of these bizarre things that came off Low, Heroes, or Lodger. And here comes Ashes to Ashes, one of the most conventional pop songs ever written. And then there's a devastating stab where he tells the world that Major Tom's a junkie, and he kills off the character he created and glorified 12 years earlier.
Do you remember a guy that's been in such an early song? I've heard a rumor from ground control. Oh no, don't say it's true.
The album Scary Monsters proved Bowie's biggest commercial success for years, while still being a pretty experimental listen. Matt Bellamy from Muse.
Scary Monsters is a brilliant album. That had a lot of influence on our, I think when we were doing our fourth album. Black Holes, we were listening to Scary Monsters quite a lot. I think it's because it had a lot of cool, really good instrumentalists on that album. Really, I mean, he always works with great musicians, but I think on that album he had a really great bass player, great guitarist, and just the arrangements were just really out there. It was when he was, I think, really experimenting away from the rock sound and getting into a more 80s sort of early funk pop sort of thing, and we just sort of were quite into that direction, at the time.
It may have been the shiny, high-concept 80s, but Bowie kept looking further afield for heroes. Bertolt Brecht, for one. Brecht was a hugely influential German poet and playwright. His first play, Baal, written in 1918, is a story of a debauched poet and musician, talented but an outcast from society, fixated on fighting, womanizing, and eventually murder. What this says about Bowie's mindset in 82, one can only guess, but he starred in a BBC production of the play, even releasing a collection of Brecht songs.
Whilst his mother's womb contained the growing bough, even then the sky was waiting quiet and pale, naked, young, immensely marvellous, like Baal loved it when he came to us. That same sky remained with him in joy and care, even when Baal slept peaceful and unaware. At night a lilac sky, a drunken vow, turning pious as the sky grows pale.
It gets harder to track Bowie's heroes during the 80s. By his own admission, he made a couple of albums that weren't that strong. But before the decline, he was catapulted into superstardom with the 1983 album, Let's Dance. Singles like Let's Dance, China Girl and Modern Love made Bowie a huge stadium star for the first time, and he chose a mainstream, highly polished pop producer to realise his ambitions. Chic guitarist and producer, Nile Rodgers.
Put on your red shoes and dance the blues. Let's dance to the song they're playing on the radio.
I met David at an after-hours club, and we started talking, and I was so amazed that his knowledge of jazz was incredible, and because of my bohemian upbringing, I was reared on jazz. So we started talking, and I think he wasn't offended that I was impressed by his knowledge of jazz, but he had to qualify it and say, nah. I come from England, and we have the BBC, and they play music based on whatever the hit is. They don't categorize it by this and that and that. He said, so I grew up with, Chuck Berry, as well as, anyone who would get a hit record. My spiritual and artistic concept is the same. Gather as much information as you can so that you make the artist's next record.
But of course, there was still an arty edge to their relationship. Bowie.
There was quite a lot of accidents, in musical accidents, working with Nile, which I adore and I encourage tremendously. Something goes wrong and it sounds great. I'll say, that's wonderful. Now repeat it 3 times. Which, if you hear an accident 3 times, it's an arrangement. It takes on a different context entirely.
Let's Dance is also a favourite of Dave Grohl.
There's a lot of Bowie eras and they're all brilliant. I really like the Let's Dance period because as a drummer, to me, that's one of the greatest air drumming albums of all time. And I mean, I can appreciate like technical drumming, sure. But to me, there's nothing better than being in a bar full of people dancing and air drumming, and none of them really know how to play the drums. I just love it.
There are very few people who Bowie never got bored of, and Scott Walker is one of those people. He was and always will be a hero to Bowie.
I went out with a girl who went out with Scott Walker. She preferred Scott Walker to me, and at night I had to listen to all his songs, night after night. She wouldn't play my music, but it did leave with me a great love for his voice. Then in the late 70s, after Eno and I had done Low and Heroes, Scott Walker brought out the most extraordinary album of his own songwriting. Quite the most lovely songs that I'd heard in years.
That album was Night Flights, and this is the title track.
There's no hold. The moving has come through. The danger brushing you turns its face into the heat and runs in tunnels. It's so cold. The dark dug up by dogs. The stitches torn and broke. The raw meat fist you choke has hit the bloodlines. Glass traps open and close on night flights. Broken necks, featherweights press the walls. Be my love, we will be gods on night flights.
On his 1995 album Outside, Bowie was embracing modern electronic music, techno, dance rock, and especially the industrial sound of Nine Inch Nails. Bowie compared them to the Velvet Underground in terms of their impact, and Nine Inch Nails co-headlined Bowie's 95 World Tour. Their frontman Trent Reznor worked with Bowie on this track, I'm Afraid of Americans.
I'm afraid of Americans. I'm afraid of the world. I'm afraid I can't help it. I'm afraid I can't. I'm afraid of Americans. I'm afraid of the world. I'm afraid I can't help it.
Bowie also kept one eye on the mainstream in the 90s, though, employing the Pet Shop Boys to remix his song Hello Space Boy, much to the delight of singer Neil Tennant.
David Bowie's song only had one verse, and we needed a second verse. I think Chris said, well, why don't you do the cut-up technique? And I said, that's a great idea. Let's bring Major Tom into it. And so I cut up the lyrics of Space Oddity. So it was ground to Major, bye-bye Tom, or something, I can't remember the words on it. And it mentions Major Tom. And then David Bowie, for the phone rang was David Bowie. And he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, we needed a second verse. So he goes, oh yeah. So we've cut up the lyrics of Space Oddity. And he said, oh yeah. And I said, he said, come up with anything interesting? And I said, well, we thought it should be about Major Tom. And I was just imagining that Major Tom's in one of those Russian spacecraft that they can't afford to bring back anymore. And he said, to which David Bowie said, oh, that's where he is.
Space boy, you're sleeping now. Your silhouette is so stationary. You're released, but your custody goes. And I wanna be free. Don't you wanna be free?
A lot of Bowie's heroes in the 90s were from the alternative rock world. At his 50th birthday concert at Madison Square Gardens in 97, the lineup included Frank Black from the Pixies, Foo Fighters, Placebo, The Cure's Robert Smith, and Billy Corgan from Smashing Pumpkins. This was Bowie being influenced by people influenced by him. Billy Corgan.
David's a lovely guy. Always had nice contact with him. He's always been very, very gracious and very, very kind to me. It really meant a lot because to me he's such a special artist. Such a unique artist, so influential, such a gifted singer, really could have been a Frank Sinatra type singer, easy, no doubt about it. The fact that he chose to be this avant-garde artist really says a lot about him as a person. I have nothing but great things to say about him. I still listen to his music all the time. I'm still inspired by him. His ideas still mean something to me.
Bowie flirted with drum and bass in the 90s and still gets beaten for it, and sometimes it did feel like he lost his way artistically. His heroes felt a bit too predictable, a bit too mainstream. He often allied himself to his contemporaries, collaborating with Goldie, Placebo, and Moby.
I did a remix for one of his songs, and we did a show together at Carnegie Hall. And to rehearse for the show, we played acoustic guitar in my bedroom. So David Bowie and I are sitting in my bedroom, and I'm playing Heroes on acoustic guitar, and he's singing, just the two of us. Well, I think Heroes is arguably the best pop rock song ever written and recorded. I mean, that kind of goes without saying. Like, it's every piece of music written and recorded since then has not been as good as Heroes.
Sitting here wishing on the cement floor, just wishing that I had just something you wore.
But there are moments of brilliance on Bowie's 90s and noughties albums. Heathen especially is a fantastic record. On it, Bowie covered this, the Pixies track Cactus. Pixies frontman Frank Black had been one of Bowie's heroes since the mid-80s.
My first meeting was in a big tent. That was his dressing room. I don't remember the context of it, but I think he was in a good mood and he was in a silly mood. I recall him pushing a peanut along the floor with his nose. Anyway, we didn't think it was strange or anything. We just, we ended up meeting him a handful of times. He's always struck me as the kind of person that he's doing it because he's enjoying doing it, and he's basically like a geeky music kid, who happens to be an international rock star, but at heart, I think he's just a fan.
Bloody your hands on a cactus tree, wipe it on your dress and send it to me. Sitting here wishing on a cement floor, just wishing that I had just something you wore.
Had to get the train from Potsdamer Platz.
So where are we now? Who are Bowie's heroes today? In the 10 years since Bowie seemingly retired, he appeared on stage with Arcade Fire twice, sung on a TV on the radio track, and voiced the character in a SpongeBob SquarePants cartoon, which shows he still has great taste in music and TV shows. Then out of nowhere, with no warning, we got Where Are We Now, a new track all about his time in Berlin. It didn't sound like Arcade Fire or TV on the radio or SpongeBob. It just sounded like David Bowie. Fragile, introspective, but definitely David Bowie. Dave Grohl.
The latest track, the Where Are We Now song, can you imagine when that song came out without warning, I played it for Taylor, who's a Bowie freak. He's read all the books. I played him the song, and he looks at me, he goes, is he gonna die? I said, I hope not.
Noel Gallagher.
Well, it's incredible. The morning that we all woke up and heard the news that this single had been released the night before, you don't get moments like that in the music business anymore. It's incredible. It's just it took me, if Bowie would have announced he was doing a few gigs, there would have been a bit of a hoo-ha for maybe 2 days and that had been it. The fact that he'd made a new record, I'm still talking about it to people. It's just an amazing thing. And for him, it's David Bowie, you know what I mean? And it's like, how do you make a record without nobody knowing? Was he doing it on his duvet, on his laptop and not telling his missus?
As it was, the fragile Bowie was a classic piece of misdirection. The album that followed was confident and abrasive, but what I love about it is that it doesn't sound like anybody else. Okay, there's a bit of Scott Walker in there, but there's so much more Bowie. Echoes of his great albums and new sounds. Maybe that's what age has brought him. He's now looking into himself for inspiration. Wayne Coyne.
His whole thing is not just being a musician, it's not just being creative, it's identity, it's who you are, Even for me, that it comes as such a relief to think, there's who you are right now, but you can be whoever you want. And you have these people, these great, creative, successful, weirdo examples of people who have done it. And he's one of them, That's why it just never occurred to me, oh, he's just a man. And that's cool.
Listening to Bowie is hearing the sound of 60 years of culture, filtered through his mind, interpreted as songs, and delivered in that wonderful voice. And that's what's kept him fascinating and relevant. Now he's become part of culture. And before it felt like he was kicking against that, trying on new genres like costumes, like we'd expect him to. However, here he is now, just sounding like himself. Maybe that's the last great reinvention, the one where you finally pull aside the curtain so people can see the real you. Where, after all you've learnt, heard and seen, you realise there are no heroes, only yourself. Or maybe that's what Bowie wants us to believe. I'm Matt Everett, and that was Bowie's Heroes.
BBC Radio 6 Music.